The philosophy of YouTube, because the medium is the message. I read this book a while ago called The Epistemology of Resistance, and in it, the author tells a story about an American college that he used to work at. So there's these frat boys at the college, right? And they decide they're going to have a party. And at the party, they have a hog roast. They roast a whole pig. And at the end of the night, one of the lads is super drunk and he decides he's going to take home the pig's head. It wasn't David Cameron. It's not that story. So he's staggering along with his pig's head and he's absolutely wasted. And he decides it would be really funny if he left it on the steps of the building opposite where they had the party. So he leaves the pig's head on the steps of the building. Haha, very funny joke, goes home to sleep it off. And in the morning, it turns out that that building is the Jewish Students' Cultural Centre. And this happened bang in the middle of the 10 days of repentance, which is a very important holy period on the Jewish calendar. Just in case anybody doesn't know, because this show is watched all over the world by people of all ages, many Jewish people choose not to eat pork, either for religious reasons, or even if they're not especially religious, just because it's part of their cultural heritage. It's been that way for thousands of years. And unfortunately, there is also a long and ongoing history of pork products being left outside Jewish religious and secular cultural centres as a deliberate anti-Semitic message. The student who left the pig's head eventually came forward and confessed, and claimed that he did not know that that building was the Jewish Students' Cultural Centre, and he further claimed that he did not know at all either about the Jewish prohibitions on eating pork, or about that part of America's largely Christian cultural heritage, a very small and nasty part, but an undeniable part nonetheless, of using pork products to make Jewish people feel unwelcome. I don't know whether that student really was as ignorant as they claimed, and neither did the author I was reading, but what the author asks is, taking their claim at face value, assuming they genuinely didn't know that, are there any grounds for saying that they should have known? Are there any grounds for saying that Jewish students are relatively common on campus, given that they are an equal part of the university community, just as much a part as that frat boy? Are there any grounds for saying that he should have been at least mildly versed in how to interact with all the members of that community without making them feel unwelcome? Not to know everything about everyone, or not to never ever make a mistake, or to always be worried about stepping on somebody's toes, but at least to know enough not to do something as egregious as leaving a pig's head outside the Jewish Students' Cultural Centre. This university was in the American South, where there is sadly a history of white supremacy and anti-Semitism, arguably an ongoing history. Like, do students have something like a duty to know that? Like, for instance, would it have been okay if the frat had decided to celebrate not with a hog roast, but by constructing a crucifix outside the Black Students' Cultural Centre and setting it on fire? It would, the author says, be at the very least irresponsible to be a member of that community which has been shaped by a history of white supremacy and the fight against it, and not be at least minimally aware of that cultural history and how it has affected the community today. Rather than talk about that specific incident, though, what I'm interested in is this question: assuming they didn't know, are there any grounds for saying that they should have known? And the author says, and I agree, that if the Jewish Students' Cultural Centre had appeared magically the day before, and there had never been any Jewish students on campus before that moment, and imagine somehow that magically every textbook and conversation this student has ever had has been completely censored of any mention of Jewish people or Judaism, they've been systematically prevented from ever getting access to that kind of information, in that case, it would be unreasonable to expect them to know that stuff. The philosopher Immanuel Kant famously said, ought implies can. You can't be morally obliged to do something if it is impossible for you to do it. I can't be morally obliged to jump into the air and fly to Mars, right? Because it's impossible. I can't do that, so I can't have a moral duty to do that. But the corollary of that idea is that the easier it is to do something, the more room we have for saying maybe you should have done it. The easier it is to dispel our ignorance, the more our ignorance starts to look less like, oh, I just didn't know, and more like, oh, I didn't want to know, or I didn't think I needed to know, which is a reflection not of the circumstances that might prevent us from gaining knowledge, but a reflection of our own values. And this, I think, is where the internet generally, and YouTube more specifically, comes in. I think it makes us more responsible. Not, oh, you took great care of the baby, you're very responsible, responsibility, but like, Uncle Ben, You are responsible for this responsibility. If I want to know how somebody else sees the world, it is easier now than at any other point in human history to find that out. If I want to know why black American athletes are kneeling during the national anthem, I can find out from their own lips, with their own words. I don't have to go through somebody else to get it. If I want to know what it's like being a trans person facing transphobia, I can find out. If I want to know what it's like being a woman facing sexual harassment at work, I can find out. If I want to know what it's like being a Muslim woman in Quebec, being told by the government what I can and can't wear, I can find out. Obviously, I can never appreciate those issues in the same way that the people directly involved can, and my take on those issues should never replace theirs in discourse. But my point is that my leeway for morally excusable ignorance is drastically shrunk by the internet. On YouTube, I can find not just words written down, but a human face, a person with subjectivity who can tell me about their life and the issues they face in a way that I just could not have done 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I would probably have had to go through the mainstream media to find those kinds of perspectives, which comes with all kinds of risks of distortion. I think there are some restrictions, though, on this moral and epistemological breaking open. One big one is that according to the World Bank, 93% of regular internet users are in the top 20% wealthiest people on Earth. So although there is still a lot of class disparity amongst people who use the internet, we do by and large represent a first world perspective. I've predicted before in The Independent that since YouTube requires a certain amount of startup capital, in societies like the UK and the US, where wealth is unevenly distributed by race, YouTubers will tend, keyword tend, towards being from wealthier, whiter backgrounds. I would be absolutely fascinated to look at any stats on that if YouTube has them. And of course, even online, not all perspectives are shared as much, given the same size platforms, signal boosted as much, received equally. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the internet has democratized listening, just diversified it slightly. And maybe that does make us all more morally responsible, which might be a bit of a scary thought, because the obstacles in the way of self-improvement, of cultivating a greater understanding for and empathy with other human beings and their perspectives, shrink away until the only obstacle that remains is the self. And at that point, to fail to improve ourselves would become a reflection not of the quantity of our obstacles, but of the quality of our hearts. Patreon.com/philosophytube helps me pay rent and stay alive. Please consider signing up and giving me a couple of dollars a month if you like what I do. Or for one-time donations, I have a tip jar at paypal.me/philosophytube.